Hi, and thanks for joining our webinar on PDF accessibility. In this webinar, we'll explore not only the rules and regulations governing document accessibility, but also the risks of being out of compliance and some things to consider while you work toward making PDFs accessible. Subsequent webinars in the series will go into more detail utilizing the Common Look tools to help fix and create accessible PDFs, but more on that later. My name's Paul Reyes. I'm the training manager at Common Look, and I'll take you through our little journey today. Now, before you start to worry about whether or not this is a sales pitch webinar, it's not. If you want one, we can talk later, but that's not the point of this webinar series. Instead, this series is intended to be educational for you on a number of different levels. Today's webinar is going to be an overview of PDF accessibility to get us all on the same page. Then, in subsequent webinars, we'll dive into some of the Common Look tools that can help with PDF accessibility. Now, like I said, this isn't a sales pitch. In fact, the Common Look tools are already widely used in the federal government, and you may even have access to them already. If you do, that's great. If you don't, then you can reach out to me or our Director of Federal Accounts, Mark Tepper, and we'll be able to send you free trials of the software so that you can play along in the other webinars in the series. I briefly had my contact information on the screen in the last slide, and at the end of the webinar, I'll put up not only my contact information again, but also Mark's info so that you can reach him if you'd like. So to briefly go over today's agenda, we're going to talk about what PDF accessibility is, just to make sure we're all on the same page with that. And then we'll talk more generally about what's driving the demand for accessibility, what the various regulations and standards are, how organizations can go about making sure that their PDFs are accessible. We'll discuss some tools to make the work not only possible, but hopefully a little easier. And we'll give you some tips that you can take away as you begin or continue making sure your PDFs are accessible and standards conformant. Please feel free to send any comments or questions that you might have to info@commonlook.com. As it says on this slide here, disability is part of the human condition. I could throw out some interesting statistics like the fact that the World Health Organization states that almost everyone at some point in life will be temporarily or permanently disabled, or that currently 1 in 7 people in the world are living with some sort of disability, or the fact that 285 million people are visually impaired and 360 million people have to deal with some kind of hearing loss. There are other things not on this slide that I could mention, like the fact that women, the elderly, and the poor are disproportionately affected, or that children from poorer households, indigenous populations, and people in ethnic minority groups are at a significantly higher risk of having a disability. But you know what? I'm not a numbers guy, and some of that information is too impersonal. What really drives the point home to me is when I interact with or hear stories about people who have disabilities and the challenges that they face. A while back, I was in LA to teach some classes. I was in the cab from the airport to my hotel, and as I like to do, I struck up a conversation with the cab driver. So, of course, the conversation made its way around to what are you doing in town and what do you do for a living and so on. So I gave him my little 30-second elevator pitch that I'm the training manager for a software company and that our software is used to test, create, and remediate PDF documents so that people who are blind, visually impaired, or have other disabilities can read them. He thought that was pretty amazing, as many people do, and he went on to tell me about when he was in college living in the dorm. Down the hall from him lived a fellow student who was blind, and perhaps due to the technology available or not available at the time, or maybe due to lack of other resources, this student had to rely on other college kids, classmates, friends, kids on work study, to read him his textbooks and assignments. And the cab driver told me how painfully frustrating it was for this kid, who wanted nothing more than to do well in school, earn his degree, and advance his life when people wouldn't show up to read him his stuff. The cabbie was telling me that this student got so frustrated that he'd punch walls and throw chairs. I can only imagine how frustrating that would be. At the same time, it gives me great pride and satisfaction knowing that what we do, what we're all working for, is making a difference, making life better for other people, perhaps giving them a little more independence and making available opportunities that some people may not otherwise have. To me, that's the reason for this in real and concrete terms. Now, disability comes in many forms. Some are illustrated on this slide here, along with some accessibility solutions, and interestingly enough, all of these apply to PDFs. For example, screen readers or Braille can be helpful for people who are blind or visually impaired. Because it's possible to embed a video in a PDF, captions are needed for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. Documents have to be navigable and usable by keyboard only, as well as with a mouse, especially if those documents contain links or fillable forms, and authors need to make sure that documents are well formatted, not only for people who have dyslexia or other cognitive disabilities, but also with regard to if and how color is being used, and whether the contrast between foreground and background is sufficient. As it says near the bottom of this slide, the critical challenge is in making sure that documents are accessible and usable by everyone. There's a lot to consider while we're doing that. More on that later. As mentioned, there are a lot of things to take into consideration so that electronic documents are accessible, and as this slide shows, if we drop the ball on that, then people could be missing out on something important. But accessible design isn't just for people who have disabilities. Accessible design makes things better for everyone. Furthermore, as we're all aware, not only is making things accessible a good business practice or the right thing to do, but it's also the law. As I'm sure you're all aware, in the federal government, Section 508 states that anything on a government website that's available to the public, as well as anything internal that constitutes agency official business and falls into at least one of 9 categories, has to be accessible. The 9 categories are emergency notifications, initial or final decisions adjudicating administrative claims or proceedings, internal or external program or policy announcements, notices of benefits, program eligibility, employment opportunities, or personnel actions, formal acknowledgments of receipt, survey questionnaires, templates or forms, educational and training materials, and intranet content that's designed as a web page. In addition, and perhaps why some of you are on this webinar today, Section 508 has been changed this year so that now it directly references WCAG 2.0 as the minimum standard of accessibility for electronic content. So, as we mentioned, the law is that stuff in the federal government has to be accessible. Of course, web and electronic content accessibility can be a confusing thing, and to make matters even more confusing, Section 508 is both a law and a standard. The law, as I've mentioned, is that stuff that's on government websites needs to be accessible. The standard part of 508 deals with the how-to of electronic content accessibility. But as I mentioned on the last slide, the Section 508 standard was recently refreshed or brought up to date so that it now is WCAG 2.0 AA. WCAG stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and it's pretty much the international standard for website accessibility. And then there's PDF UA, the UA standing for Universal Accessibility, which is an accessibility standard specific to PDF. In addition, HHS has their own standard, which is basically a little bit WCAG and a little bit extra to make it more rigorous. So on the last slide, I briefly mentioned the various accessibility standards that apply to PDF. You may be asking yourself, then, which one do I choose? For the federal government, the minimum accessibility standard is WCAG 2.0 AA. The PDF UA and HHS standards go above and beyond the WCAG requirements, but PDF UA can, for example, be used to help make sure your PDF passes WCAG. Furthermore, the Access Board does say that if you'd like to meet more than just the minimum, you're allowed to do that. So existing PDFs need to be at least WCAG 2.0 conformant, but the Access Board has also stated that tools capable of exporting PDF files must be able to make them PDF UA compliant. On a side note, when we get into the actual Common Look tools, I'll show you how to do that. So to discuss the standards now in a little more detail, starting with WCAG 2.0, the new 508. Created by the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, was originally designed, as the name states, for web content, HTML. The whole idea was to increase web accessibility for everyone, whether or not they have a disability. There are 4 guiding principles: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. In a nutshell, perceivable means that content can't be hidden from all senses. Operable means that people need to be able to operate the website, follow the links, navigate, etc. Understandable means that content needs to be written at a reading level such that people can comprehend it. Finally, robust means that the content has to be able to be viewed on various machines and platforms, think smartphones, tablets, and laptops, and that as technology advances, content that was once accessible can't become inaccessible. Within these 4 principles are 12 guidelines, and each guideline has testable success criteria at 3 different levels: A, AA, and AAA. The A level is pretty much the bare minimum to make content accessible. The AA level is the middle of the road, and it ensures that content is not only accessible, but also more usable than it might be at the A level. The AAA level is WCAG's highest level of accessibility and the hardest to achieve. In fact, it might not always be attainable for every checkpoint, and seeing as a website would have to pass every checkpoint at the AAA level to be AAA conformant, the standard that the world uses and the new 508 refresh has adopted is WCAG 2.0 AA. Finally, while WCAG was originally developed for HTML, it applies really well to PDF too. And then there's PDF UA. As mentioned, the UA stands for Universal Accessibility, and this is a really rigorous technical standard specific to PDF and geared toward developers and authors implementing PDF writing and processing software. As such, it provides definitive terms and requirements for accessibility in PDF documents and applications. Aside from introductory sections and glossaries, there's 3 main sections that most people care about. From a developer standpoint, you might care about the section pertaining to how PDF rendering software should display the PDF. You might also care about the section that discusses how assistive technology should handle PDFs. Or, from a PDF testing and remediation standpoint, you might be most interested in the section that addresses PDF accessibility at the document tagging level. So that's a little bit of general knowledge about WCAG and PDF UA, but let's dig a little deeper into understanding what their differences are. WCAG was developed for web, whereas PDF UA was developed specifically for PDF. Because it applies to everything that could possibly be on a website, WCAG is more broad in scope, and there are some instances where WCAG addresses things that just don't have to be addressed by PDF UA because they don't apply to PDFs. Things like frames on a web page or client-side image maps. To examine the differences a little more closely, for example, with video-only content, WCAG requires an alternative or an audio track that provides equivalent information. PDF UA just says that tagged media needs to have an alternate description, similar to alternative text for an image. However, it doesn't say how to do this, how much information needs to be included, and so on. Furthermore, while embedded videos are fairly common on websites, many people haven't seen embedded videos in PDFs or Didn't even know that was possible. Also, XFA PDF is allowed in WCAG, but not in PDF UA, because technically it's not PDF, it's XFA. On the PDF UA side of things, aside from the differences I've already mentioned, PDF UA is PDF specific, thus not addressing things like XFA. This also means that while PDF UA does address tagging audio-video content that might be in a PDF and giving it an alternative description, PDF UA doesn't address the accessibility of the video or audio itself. So, for example, it doesn't address captioning videos. Also, while WCAG has the four main principles, remember POUR, PDF UA doesn't address these principles. It deals solely with how to make the PDF accessible. And PDF UA doesn't dictate how a PDF should look or be designed as long as it's accessible in the tagging, reading order, etc. In addition, while PDF UA says that if JavaScript is used in a PDF, then the script needs to be accessible, because it's not a JavaScript standard, it doesn't go into how to make that happen. As I mentioned earlier, there are requirements for making sure that PDFs are consistently and reliably presented, whether that's in print, electronically, or being read by assistive technology. To that end, fonts need to be embedded so that the author's intent is maintained and so that the text remains legible. There are also specific rules regarding reading order and tagging. For example, PDF UA addresses reading order for things like newspaper articles, where the story starts on one page and then continues on another. PDF UA is also more specific about how more specific about how heading levels are to be used in documents. Hopefully now you have a little bit better understanding not only of the regulations and motivators for accessibility, but you also get some of the inner workings of the standards too. Of course, at this point you might be thinking, yeah, okay, I got it. It's important. I knew it was tricky and confusing before, and it's even worse now. Great. What's presented on this slide here is a multi-phase plan to achieve document accessibility. In the next few slides, we'll dissect this plan and take a closer look at key items in each step. Here's the same plan again, identifying those key items. In phase 1, you're going to do things like set the goals for your organization. Choose what standard you want to conform to. Probably for government folks, you're going to choose WCAG 2.0 AA and test your documents to see where you stand. But when it comes to the actual testing, do you do it yourself or should you hire someone else? If you know where all of your documents are, if you have the time and the expertise, and if you have access to trustworthy tools, then maybe it would be worth it to do the testing yourself. However, some organizations don't even know how many PDFs they have, where they are, there's way too many to test, or perhaps all of this is new to you. For any or all of those reasons, it might be better to outsource the work to someone who's set up to do it and do it well. If you choose to take on the work yourselves, here are some tools that you might consider using. Of course, along with learning about the various accessibility standards themselves, it's important to keep in mind that most testing tools and remediation tools, when we get to talking about that phase, are going to have a learning curve associated with them. One very popular tool is the checker built into Adobe Acrobat. Keep in mind, too, that we'll come back to talk about Acrobat again when we talk about remediation tools, but I'm just going to focus on testing for now. So, if you have Adobe Acrobat, including Acrobat DC, then you have a checker already in your possession. There's nothing else you need to buy to use this tool. And, to its credit, when Acrobat is used to test a PDF, it can create a report of the issues that it finds. A big drawback to the Acrobat checker is that it doesn't actually test PDFs against any recognized standard. As a result, documents can pass the Acrobat check and still fail WCAG 2.0, the new 508, PDF UA, and HHS. In addition, The Acrobat check isn't always 100% accurate. Here's an easy example. If you have an image in the document that's been placed in a figure tag, and that figure tag has complete gibberish for the alternative text, which is what screen readers use to tell people what it's an image of, in this situation, when someone listens to that figure tag, they'll only hear gibberish. But because the figure tag has alt text, the Acrobat check will automatically pass it. In contrast, as we'll see with some other tools, the alt text on figures, along with document title, alt text on links, and other accessibility issues, come up as user verification items so that someone actually checks to make sure that there aren't any of these hidden errors. Sure, that might take more time to test a document, but it's necessary. There's no quick button for make accessible. It requires human interaction. And anyone who tells you that PDF accessibility can be done 100% through automation either doesn't really understand PDF accessibility or they're lying to you and probably trying to sell you something. The PAC2 checker is another tool that can be used to test PDF documents, and this one will actually test against PDF UA. Other benefits of this tool are that it's free. It's possible to easily check the tricky things like role mapping of tags to make sure that custom tags will be correctly recognized and handled by assistive technology. And the screen reader preview is pretty cool. Unfortunately, like the Acrobat check, if an image has anything at all assigned to its alt text, it'll pass in PAC2 unless you manually verify it yourself. Other drawbacks to the PAC2 checker include the fact that because it's a separate download, your IT people might need to get involved. You can't save the report. There's not much explanation available for the failures and warnings that it finds, and there's no functionality at all available to fix any issues. Like the PAC2 checker, the Common Look Validator is another free tool for testing PDFs. Some other benefits of the Common Look Validator are that it will actually test against WCAG 2.0, HHS, and PDF UA. It generates a report that can be saved. You can actually customize it, for example, turning on and off checkpoints and testing criteria to fit the specific needs of your organization. For checkpoints like alt text on images that require manual verification, you can change the status to passing or failing if needed, and you can easily view tag properties, role mapping like in the PAC2 checker, and more. Similar to the PAC2 checker, the Common Look Validator is a separate download, so while it is free, your IT people might need to get involved with the installation. In addition, while it's possible to change the status of something from user verification required to passed or failed, it doesn't really have any document remediation functionality. That said, Common Look PDF Global Access, the software to remediate PDFs, does have the functionality to not only test the PDFs, but to fix them as well. But right now, we're only talking about checkers. Keep in mind, too, that all of the tools that I've mentioned so far are for testing PDFs individually. There are tools available to test documents in bulk, but we'll wait and talk about those when we get to Phase 5, monitoring. So with Phase 1, setting the goals, testing, and so on, complete, we move on to Phase 2. Here is where you come up with your remediation strategy to fix the problem documents that you found. And again, the question is, do you do this internally or do you outsource it? Clearly, there are pros and cons to each approach. If you decide to do it yourself, fortunately, there are tools available to help make the job easier. If you know what you're doing, or if you have the time and resources to learn, then doing it internally can help to build the strength and knowledge that you, your team, and your organization possesses. Of course, therein lies the challenge too, the time, effort, and training needed. Some organizations will take a blended approach in which they outsource some of the more challenging documents while they get up to speed internally on the less complicated ones. Outsourcing, especially to a reputable contractor or vendor, can make life a lot easier for you, can make the remediation process go a whole lot faster, and if the vendor guarantees and stands behind their work, then this can help to mitigate your legal risk. However, outsourcing could be expensive, requires time, and depending on your procurement requirements, this could be a lot of time, and you really want to be careful about who you hire. A lot of contractors or vendors claim to be able to make PDFs accessible, but then in reality, they fall short of the mark. Of course, you're going to do your due diligence. So just like the testing phase, let's pretend for a second that you decide to do the remediation work in-house. There are essentially two tools for the job. And again, keep in mind that any software is going to have a learning curve. The first tool to mention is, again, Adobe Acrobat. And just like for testing, it does have its benefits. The remediation functionality is built into Adobe Acrobat Professional. So if you've got that software already, then you have your tool. And just like we said, when you use it to test documents, you can generate a report. However, there are some drawbacks to using Adobe Acrobat for remediating PDFs. As is the case when using it as a checker, it doesn't actually certify that your document meets any particular standard. In fact, in older versions of Acrobat, you used to be able to check a checkbox for the option to run a 508 check, but then when it was done testing, a disclaimer came up saying that it wasn't actually certifying conformance to any particular standard. Also, as mentioned before, it's possible to get false negatives or false positives. After using Acrobat to test your document, there is some help available in addressing the issues that it finds, which is good. When following the links to their online help, it references WCAG 2.0. So if you're trying to conform with PDF UA or HHS, you're kind of on your own. In addition, some of the help available online is either incomplete or inaccurate. In addition, if you've used Adobe Acrobat to remediate PDFs, you know that it can be clunky, inefficient. Mistakes are easy to make, and along those lines, undo isn't really an option, although there is some undo functionality available now in DC. The other tool available for remediating PDFs is Common Look PDF Global Access. As mentioned when we were talking about checkers, Common Look PDF is an additional download that might require permission, IT help, etc., and it's not free. Unlike Acrobat, Common Look PDF will test and help remediate in accordance with multiple standards, including WCAG 2.0, HHS, and PDF UA. In addition, like the validator, the standards checkpoints can be custom configured to further meet the specific needs of your organization. Remediators can also generate a compliance report when the PDF is fixed to show that it's been tested and meets the criteria for whatever standard was chosen. In addition, when it comes to doing the actual work, there are many tools and features within the software to make the work go faster, easier, more accurately, and if you make a mistake, there is undo available that can take you step by step all the way back to your last save. When I'm teaching classes and we get to that part, the people who have been slugging it out in Acrobat for a while before learning Common Look always cheer when they hear that. So continuing on in the PDF accessibility process, now that you've started fixing your PDFs, or maybe you've gotten them all fixed and that solution is under control, the next thing is to make sure that PDFs are created in the future are accessible as well. The best way to go about this is to take a proactive approach during document design and creation as opposed to just making the PDFs and then fixing them later. Training your document creators, designers, and authors is an important step here. Lots of times when I teach PDF remediation classes, I end up teaching the document designers. Often there are these aha moments when they realize that, oh, if I do this when I'm creating the document, then I wouldn't have to do all of that to fix it later. Those eureka moments are fun to watch. When you take a proactive approach, it'll end up saving your organization time and money in the end. When creating documents, use styles where you can. Use list creating functionality when it's available. Be aware of color use, contrast between foreground and background, and add accurate alternative text to your images. Thankfully, there are a number of tools to help you at this stage too. Many authoring tools have checkers built in. They might not assure conformance to a particular standard, but they're better than nothing. Also, CommonLook has a plugin for Word and PowerPoint to make your standard conformant PDF directly from either of those applications. In fact, CommonLook has you covered here too with the 508 refresh. Remember when I said that tools capable of exporting PDF files must be able to make them PDF UA compliant? CommonLook Office does this in Word and PowerPoint. Similarly, if you're using InDesign, I hear good things about Made to Tag. Now, to be fair, I don't use InDesign, so I've never checked out Made to Tag, but like I said, I hear good things. There are other tools out there too, depending on what authoring software you're using. The point is, find them, learn about them, and consider using them. In Phase 4, you're continuing to ramp up your accessibility efforts, knowledge, and expertise. Maybe if you decided to outsource your testing and remediation before, you'll look into bringing it in-house during this phase. You'll also want to check in with other departments and make sure that accessibility is making its way through the organization and that there is a consistent, cohesive approach. Finally, Phase 5, assessing and monitoring. It's important for organizations to not only find and test their PDFs, but also to make sure that new PDFs put online are accessible as well. In addition, you might also want to create and or maintain compliance data in case a legal situation comes up. One word of caution regarding this phase: if you decide to outsource your scanning and monitoring, make sure that the people testing your PDFs really understand PDF. There's a lot of companies who will test the HTML side of websites, and many of them will claim to check the PDFs too. But unless they really understand the intricacies of PDF accessibility, you could still be vulnerable. Also, as I mentioned in Phase 1, if anyone tells you that their testing is 100% automated and 100% comprehensive and accurate, they're either lying or they don't really understand PDF accessibility. In fact, there's no phase of PDF accessibility that can be done 100% with automation, and that includes the remediation work too. If you're going to outsource this part, make sure you choose a vendor and or products who will really test and monitor things accurately. Back when we were talking about testing in Phase 1, I mentioned testing PDFs in bulk. There are vendors, software products, and services out there to test PDFs in bulk, but again, you want to be careful, ask the right questions, and do your research. When it comes to accessibility, machines can't test everything. For example, the color checkpoint can be a tricky one. The rule is don't use color as the only way of conveying information. The problem here is that while a machine can automatically test and detect color changes in a document, the only way to tell whether or not color is the only way that information is being conveyed is to actually look at the document, read it, and figure it out from there. The same goes for verifying the reading order. These things simply cannot be tested and verified 100% without human interaction. So here you go. You're dangerously informed, and now it's time to take action. This slide is basically a recap of what we've gone over. Verify, remediate either in-house or through outsourcing it, and continue to learn standards, practices, tools, and so on. Little by little, as you get more familiar with the whole idea, you can bring more in-house if you so choose. As we wind down this part of our presentation, we'll just briefly touch on some tips for your document accessibility success. Specific to this slide are tips for your organization and the people in it. For example, create a team so you don't have to fight this fight or learn everything by yourself. Get the bosses on board early so that they know it's important, why it's important, and so that when decisions, perhaps cuts, have to be made further down the line, accessibility maintains its importance and its place. Invest in the people and the tools to be able to do it right. And when outsourcing, be sure to do your due diligence and choose a partner who really knows their stuff, especially when it comes to the complexities of PDF. Similarly, when it comes to the documents themselves, it's helpful to be aware of your document inventory, which are higher priority, and what standard to use. Not only is choosing the correct standard important, by the way, but when outsourcing, you'll want to make sure that you're very specific with your vendor regarding project needs, verifying that the work has been done correctly, and so on. From a legal risk standpoint, tackle the low-hanging fruit right away. If people are on your website and they can easily find inaccessible stuff, that makes you an easy target. Similarly, fix the documents on your website that everyone needs to read. Then, if your remediation project includes a lot of files, knock the easy ones out quickly. These are the ones with only a few pages, mostly straight text with maybe only a couple of images, nothing too complex. Use these documents to test your contractors and see how they do on the simpler and probably cheaper ones before you give them the documents that are longer or harder, more expensive to fix. Remember to design with accessibility in mind. It just makes things better for everyone, whether or not they have any disabilities. And make sure that you're checking your work along the way so that you don't get to the end of a project and then have to go back and fix stuff. Addressing accessibility at the end instead of at the beginning of your project can really slow things down and make things more expensive as deadlines have to be pushed back and quite possibly things need to be redesigned. Also, keep checking along the way to catch anything that pops up before it's too late. So I hope that you've found this helpful and informative. I know I've thrown a lot of information out there at you, and I hope it wasn't too overwhelming. Feel free to check out our website, commonlook.com, or email your thoughts, comments, and questions to info@commonlook.com. As I mentioned at the beginning, the other webinars in this series will all involve using the various CommonLook tools. The next two will be on CommonLook PDF, and then the last one will be using CommonLook Office. If you don't have the CommonLook tools, and if you'd like free trials to check out, please contact Mark Tepper, M-T-E-P-P-E-R, @commonlook.com, or send me an email at prayus@commonlook.com. Thanks for watching.